Good evening. I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Tuesday, September 27th. We begin tonight on the East Coast, where the aftermath of post-tropical storm Fiona has warranted a visit by the Prime Minister. Justin Trudeau is traveling through Atlantic Canada today. This is where he's inspecting the extensive damage caused by Fiona. Mr. Trudeau says some infrastructure was completely overwhelmed by the storm. The post-tropical storm left a trail of destruction across a wide swath of Atlantic Canada. It stretches from Nova Scotia's eastern mainland to Cape Breton, PEI, and southwestern Newfoundland. Mr. Trudeau says extreme weather events are going to get more intense and severe over the coming years. He adds that Canada will need to adapt to the impacts of a changing climate. Meanwhile, Fiona is also being blamed for destroying two well-known natural landmarks, one in PEI and the other in Nova Scotia. In PEI, a sandstone rock formation known as Teacup Rock was toppled by the storm on Saturday, and a massive oak tree in Shubenacadie, Nova Scotia, has also been taken down. The picturesque rock formation was north of Darnley, PEI, along the Northumberland Strait, and the Shubenacadie tree, named after the nearby village, was thought to be about 300 years old. Moving to Alberta now, where the Justice Minister isn't happy with Ottawa about its plan to confiscate assault-style weapons this fall. Tyler Shandro says the Trudeau government's potential seizure of thousands of assault-style weapons is politically motivated. Since May 2020, the federal government has prohibited more than 1,500 different models of firearms, and it committed to establishing a buyback program. Coalition Avenir Quebec leader François Legault campaigned for a second day in the Isle de la Madeleine region. This is where post-tropical storm Fiona caused significant damage to seaside infrastructure. Polls indicate the CAQ is in a tight race on the island archipelago with the Parti Québécois, whose candidate Joël Arsenault won the riding by 15 votes over his Liberal rival in 2018. Meanwhile, Quebec Liberal leader Dominique Anglade was on a media blitz today to raise her profile ahead of next week's election. Well, some Ontarians who celebrate Diwali are criticizing the fact that the province's municipal elections fall during the South Asian holiday, which many compare to Christmas. Municipal election dates are fixed under a provincial act, and the government says those who can't make it to the polls on election day can vote by mail at advanced voting stations or by proxy. Ryan Singh of the Indo-Caribbean Canadian Association says it could lead to lower voter turnout among those who celebrate the festival. Turning to Manitoba now, where a Winnipeg surgeon, Dr. Gigi Osler, has been tapped for a seat in the Senate. Dr. Osler is also a University of Manitoba professor and the president of the Federation of Medical Women in Canada. She was among two new appointees named for the upper chamber yesterday by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Dr. Osler and longtime bureaucrat Ian Shugart of Ontario were recommended to Mr. Trudeau by the Independent Advisory Board for appointments to the Senate. Dr. Osler became the first female surgeon and the first racialized woman to hold the presidency at the Canadian Medical Association in 2018. A new survey by consulting firm Eckler finds that Canadian employers are forecasting a 4.2% increase next year in the national average base salary. Eckler says the highest average salary increases are expected in BC, Ontario, and Quebec. This while Yukon, Nunavut, and Prince Edward Island are projected to see the lowest. The largest average salary increases are expected to be in the technology sector at 5.4%. Meanwhile, the smallest are expected in the education, healthcare, agriculture, and hospitality sectors. Visitors heading south to Seattle can finally make the trek by rail again. Amtrak has resumed its Cascade service between Vancouver and Seattle after 2 years. The service is restarting with a single daily round trip departing Seattle at 7:45 a.m. and leaving Vancouver at 5:45 p.m. Amtrak plans to add a second daily trip when equipment and staffing allow. In a step toward reconciliation, a Saskatchewan highway will now establish treaty territory borders. Large signs have been installed on Highway 11 near Bladworth. They declare to all who pass by that they are on treaty territory. Motorists heading south are told they're entering Treaty 4 territory, and those heading north see they're entering Treaty 6 territory. Mary Culbertson, the Treaty Commissioner of Saskatchewan, says they will spark dialogue and educate. The minister responsible for First Nations, Métis, and Northern Affairs says it is another step toward reconciliation. A deeper look at BC's overdose crisis coming up after the break, so stay tuned to Forum Daily. We'll be right back shortly. Police and health officials in the Okanagan region of BC are sounding the alarm. This comes after 5 people died of overdoses in the span of 9 hours on Saturday. The deaths occurred in Kelowna, and police say that officers responded to 3 different locations. The RCMP are asking anyone who uses drugs to be safe by never using them alone. They also recommend using at safe injection sites, testing drugs before use, and carrying naloxone. Meanwhile, BC officials continue to battle a toxic drug supply in a province that sees an average of 6 deaths per day, according to the Provincial Coroner's Service. Well, joining us now to tell us more about the situation on the West Coast is Guy Felicella, peer clinical advisor with the BC Centre on Substance Use. Mr. Felicella, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me.
Now, what do we know so far about the 5 overdoses on Saturday and the people affected?
Well, I mean that they died alone. Some died in their residence. It's just ongoing. Tragically, an unpredictable drug supply is just continuing to increase, which is, killing a lot of people in our province and our country.
Now, as you said, these deaths happened alone, and according to the coroner's service, about 84% of illicit toxicity deaths occur indoors, while 15% occur outside. So how do we address an overdose crisis if they are primarily hidden from the public?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's really hard. I think there's so much, stigma and discrimination around substance use in our society, depending on where you live. And that drives people to use alone. I think one of the things that definitely needs to happen is that if people are using alone in their homes, that they should have access to, safer substances with known controlled doses that they know that they're consuming. Because really, what's killing people is not knowing what they're taking. It may look the same one time, and then they buy it again, and it's not the same, and sadly, they succumb to it.
And what do we know so far about the demographics of those most impacted in the province?
Well, Indigenous people are disproportionately impacted by it, but also after that, I mean, it's really, in every community, it can be anyone. There's a lot of here, especially, the trades industry is impacted highly by substance use as well, and so there's people with that are using in their private residence. They have jobs, families, but unfortunately, there's no margin of error anymore. And 78% are males, and I think one of the biggest reasons with that is that males don't like to talk about their struggles, and so they die in isolation.
Some very heartbreaking facts there. Now, the RCMP and officials are promoting using supervised consumption sites. So how do these sites differ from private or personal residences in terms of comfortability and safety for the user, especially when it comes to users from minority communities, as you mentioned?
Yeah, no, it's extremely challenging to access a supervised consumption site when there isn't one in your community as well. And so a lot of the places where deaths are being impacted by overdose, there isn't a supervised consumption site. And if there is, sometimes people, are just uncomfortable using them, for various reasons. Obviously, it could be, beef on the street, but also too, if somebody's not, having problematic substance use as well, they're not going to use a supervised consumption site. Their intermittent substance users are people who can die as well. Not all people who are using these substances have an addiction to them. There's a lot of people that just use substances in our society. And, for them, they're at an extremely high risk as well.
All right, Mr. Felicella, about a minute left here, but what else is missing here in terms of addressing the overdose crisis in BC?
Well, first off, I think people need access to safer substances. And, when you hear a safer supply out in British Columbia, I mean, yeah, sure, for some, but not everybody can access it, especially if you don't have a substance use disorder. And then also, too, for people that want to stop using, the access to get into treatment and detox is, a wait list. And so, these wait lists, while people are waiting to access services, sadly, they still are using substances and dying because they're waiting, or after they finish detox after 7 days, they can't access a treatment facility for an extra couple of weeks, and they're supposed to now leave detox, go back to the same environment that they left, and white knuckle it until a treatment center opens up. And so that's just, there's so many gaps in the system that need to be repaired to move people forward quicker.
Lots of important points to consider, Mr. Felicella. Thank you again for your time today.
Thank you, Nima. Have a great day.
We'll be right back. Vladimir Putin's partial mobilization of hundreds of thousands of reservists last week has brought the war in Ukraine across the border to Russia. This comes as Russians revolt against the order in an unusual but bold move. In just a matter of days, the decree has triggered outrage, protests, and acts of violence across the country. Demonstrations can be seen from the biggest cities in the country to the most remote regions of Russia. It has also sparked a fearful exodus of men of fighting age from the country. With us now to unpack the situation is Mr. John Hardy, Russian Program Deputy Director at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Great to be with you.
So, what does Mr. Putin's partial mobilization entail for Russians, and who would be called upon?
Sure. So, in theory, it's only supposed to call up folks with prior military experience, and especially folks with certain specialties that are needed in Ukraine. In practice, we're seeing that a vast many more categories of people are being called up. Folks without military experience, even in some cases, disabled people, things of that nature. It seems that the Ministry of Defense has sort of given quotas to the regions and said, okay, you take it from here. And in response, the regional authorities are sort of scrambling to hit their targets and just vacuuming up as many people as they can in a short period of time.
Now, initially, this order was to call up 300,000 potential troops, but there is a lot of concern around the actual number of men being mobilized in this order and whether they are in fighting condition or not, as you have mentioned. So tell us a little bit more about what you've been hearing in terms of the numbers here.
Right. So, as you just mentioned, the public number was 300K. There's been reports about, a million, 200,000. We'll see. Regardless, Russia, the current Russian army is not the Soviet army. It's designed for mass mobilization. So it's going to take time, some months, to hit, many hundreds of thousands of mobilized troops. So this will happen in phases, regardless of the ultimate number. And I suspect over the next month, 2 months, 3 months, we'll start to get a sense of exactly how far they'll go. And it might be that Moscow decides in 2 months' time, hey, we're going to need another 100, 200K, whatever, and then they'll go from there. I think the big question is, overall, will they stick to the specialized, kind of narrowly targeted mobilization of people with military experience, or will they really go much broader? It's hard to tell just from TikTok videos and whatnot from mobilized Russians, whether these examples of people with no military experience being mobilized are isolated cases, or if this is going to be a significant chunk of the mobilized population.
All right, Mr. Hardy, tell us a little bit more about the situation on the ground in the country. What has been the response so far from Russians?
Well, there's been protests in a number of cities. However, they've been relatively small scale. I think the first day or so there was maybe 1,300 detained protesters, and the Russian authorities are actually giving many of them draft summons, probably as a way to deter a future protest. So I think that the Kremlin seems to be banking on some public opposition, but not really a critical level. So at least right now, they're probably feeling okay about it. I don't think anything we've seen so far is beyond the Russian government's ability to handle.
All right, sir, just about a minute left here. But in other major news, we know the referendum voting on annexation ends today in the Russian occupied regions of Ukraine. But we do know the outcome is widely expected to be predetermined. So, how would this likely impact the ongoing war? Could you see Ukrainians in these potentially annexed regions being forced to fight for Russia?
Well, so in the areas that were already occupied, before the full-scale invasion, there's been a lot of that, and I think actually the Russians have probably forcibly mobilized just about everybody they can there. They're probably just about out on manpower in those areas. Yet maybe they'll try to do the same thing in the others. There's been some reports of that going on, or at least preparations for it. But we'll have to see. In general, I don't think that'd be a great strategy for Russia. These people, for obvious reasons, most of them are not going to be very motivated to fight for the Russians.
All right, Mr. Hardy, lots to keep our eyes on as this war unfolds. Again, thank you so much for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you.
All right, we'll be right back after a short break. When Forum Daily returns, we'll be taking a look at the major news stories and headlines from around the world. Reports of sabotage over natural gas pipelines in Europe. Hurricane Ian is on its way to Florida after blasting Cuba. And Japan holds a controversial state funeral for assassinated former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. We'll have these stories and more news from around the world after the break. So stay with us. We'll be back shortly. Authorities in Sweden say they've detected two explosions close to unusual leaks in a pair of natural gas pipelines. The Swedish National Seismic Network says it registered the blasts near the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines, which run under the Baltic Sea to Germany. Leaders of Poland and Denmark have raised concerns that the leaks along the Russian-owned pipelines were sabotage. Experts claim that Russia could be looking for a way to further shake up natural gas markets. This would add to the growing energy crisis sparked by the war in Ukraine. Hurricane Ian tore into western Cuba as a major hurricane today, and the U.S. National Hurricane Center says it's going to get worse. Ian made landfall over Cuba today with significant wind and storm surge impacts. Top sustained winds of 205 kilometers per hour pummeled the island. Ian is expected to grow into a Category 4 storm before it hits Florida tomorrow. 2.5 million Florida residents were ordered to evacuate. Meanwhile, countries in the Asia-Pacific are facing their own dangerous storm. Vietnam has imposed a curfew and evacuated over 800,000 people from their homes. This comes as a powerful typhoon aims for the country's central region today. Typhoon Noru already flooded villages and left at least 8 dead in the Philippines. Moscow's referendums in Russian-occupied regions of Ukraine reached their final day of voting today. The votes are expected to serve as a pretext for Moscow to annex Russian-held regions of the country. But the preordained outcome is already heightening tensions between Russia and the West. The annexation of the 4 occupied regions in southern and eastern Ukraine could happen as soon as this Friday. They set the stage for a dangerous new phase in the 7-month war in Ukraine. Russia warned that it could resort to deploying nuclear weapons to defend its territory, including newly acquired lands. Turning to Japan now, where assassinated former leader Shinzo Abe was given a rare state funeral today, but many see the service as offensive. Prime Minister Fumio Kishida said the publicly financed ceremony was a well-deserved honor for Japan's longest-serving modern political leader. But it has deeply split public opinion. Japan's main political opposition parties boycotted the funeral, which critics say was used to fan nationalism. Moving to Italy now, where former Premier Silvio Berlusconi is making his return to Italy's parliament. This comes nearly a decade after being banned from holding public office over a tax fraud conviction. Mr. Berlusconi was re-elected to the Senate in Sunday's elections, which indicated a far-right-led alliance would take power. In 2013, the Senate expelled Mr. Berlusconi because of a tax fraud conviction stemming from his media business. Meanwhile, Colombian pop singer Shakira is dealing with her own tax fraud scandal. A Spanish judge today approved a trial for her on her charges of tax fraud. Spanish prosecutors accused the entertainer in 2018 of failing to pay the equivalent of $13.9 million US in taxes. This was on income earned between 2012 and 2014. They are seeking an 8-year prison sentence and a hefty fine if she is found guilty of tax evasion. The 45-year-old Shakira has repeatedly denied any wrongdoing and rejected a plea deal to avoid going to trial. Pharma giant Biogen has agreed to pay $900 million to resolve allegations that it violated U.S. federal law. Now, this was by paying kickbacks to doctors, persuading them to prescribe its multiple sclerosis drugs. Under terms of the settlement, Biogen will pay more than $843 million to the federal government and more than $56 million to 15 states for overbilling government insurance programs. A NASA spacecraft rammed an asteroid at blistering speed on Monday. This was in a first-of-its-kind test dress rehearsal for the day a killer rock menaces Earth. The galactic Grand Slam occurred against a harmless asteroid 11 million kilometers away last night. This was in a bid to alter the asteroid's orbit. Now, NASA won't know for a couple of months just how much the DART spacecraft nudged the asteroid with the impact, but Mission Control's Elena Adams told reporters that she thinks Earthlings should sleep better now that it appears that our first planetary defense test was a success. Well, there is some relieving news following the blast from post-tropical storm Fiona. Parks Canada says the wild horses on Sable Island are doing well after enduring the storm this weekend. A spokesperson says the horses instinctively seek shelter in groups during storms. Zoe Lucas, president of the Sable Island Institute, says that by Sunday, the horses were back to grazing and grooming. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, or follow us on social media. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time.